No, because
there'll be a box when you leave, and the theory is that unless you are a really peculiar person and have a real serious problem, not of identity, you aren't going to need your identity pad. And so they will recycle them. If you wish to take your name piece of paper out, by all means do that. But it's because we don't really care about the piece of paper. What we care about is the plastic. So please let us have that back. There'll be a box, put it back. So we're going to talk now about a few things. My name is Gary Grancio. This is Anna Charlton. We have from 1990 to 2000, we ran the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Clinic, in which we.
Yeah, you can't turn off the mic or something.
Oh, you can't. Okay.
No.
Oh, okay. You can't hear me back there?
No, sort of.
God, you're hearing impaired. All right. All right. I didn't want to stand. I thought it was hierarchical. I thought those other people could be hierarchical if they want. But I'm going to be more proletariat. But no, that's okay. All right. So Anna and I ran the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Clinic together. We represented a lot of activists. We represented people who didn't want to do dissection and vivisection. We represented people who were in prison who wanted vegan food. We represent, we try to stop wild horse roundups. We did all sorts of things. Many of our clients were large animal rights organizations, and so after a while, when none of them were speaking to us anymore, largely as a result of my writing, we decided to just shut that little enterprise down. However, but we're now interestingly, we teach a class here called Human Rights and Non-Human Rights, and we talk about racism, sexism, heterosexism, and speciesism. And it's really interesting. We've got about 70 students this semester, and which is for a law school a pretty healthy enrollment. And we talk about how we as humans otherize, whether it's people of color, whether it's women, or whether it's gay people, or whether it's on the basis of class, or whether it's on the basis of species, and how the mechanisms of otherization are very similar. And that's what we do in that class. But what we're gonna, both of us, we're gonna do something a little bit different. I mean, it was hard. After this morning's presentation, we both we caucused in my office, and we basically decided to do something a little bit different because we thought it would be better and more responsive to what was going on if we try to address some of these issues and make it more of a discussion. And we hope that you'll stay till 6 o'clock and participate in the question and answer period. There's a key question that Will and Sue raised in Zoopolis, and they ask, why is the animal rights position, when I talk about animal rights, what I mean is what I now call the abolitionist position. I used to call it the animal rights position in the 1990s until animal rights became a meaningless expression. I mean, so that basically now, people who raise animals for food think of themselves as animal rights people. As a matter of fact, I started a book in 2010 with an observation that Randy Strauss, who was one of the owners of Strauss Veal, the largest veal producer in the United States, talked about how much he cared about animal rights. And I made the observation, when veal producers, or any animal food producer, starts talking about how much they care about animal rights, animal rights has become a meaningless expression. So now I talk about abolition, and now all the welfarists are saying, well, I'm an abolitionist too, so it'll be another 10 years, I'll have to come up with something else. But basically, the idea is the negative right, that we cannot justify eating, wearing, using animals, period. That's what I mean when I talk about animal rights. And so Sue and Will ask what I think is an important question. They say, why is it that the animal rights position is so politically marginalized, that which it is. I mean, it's a really marginalized position. And they asked the question, why is that? And there are some reasons they give that I would agree with them on. But the one that they give that I would not agree on, and the one that they do, the one that they give I don't agree on, is they say, well, part of the problem is that the animal rights position is politically marginalized because it doesn't take into account the fact that people want to continue to interact with animals, and so it's like sort of the animal rights theory is sort of a big downer. It's like you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, but what can you do with animals? And so, and I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is the thing that they don't acknowledge, which is that the animal movement, the modern animal movement, has gone out of its way from the late 1970s onward to suppress the animal rights message, so that the modern animal movement is absolutely hostile to the animal rights position. It is that, I think, that accounts for why animal rights theory is politically marginal. I mean, there would always be a problem, because this is a society in which animal agriculture means a lot of money, and because of the economic considerations, there will always be resistance to getting rid of exploitative industries, okay? But I think a major problem, and in my judgment, the crisis that those of us who care about animals face is dealing with these large charities, these large corporate charities that are doing everything they can to suppress and marginalize the abolitionist position, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about the modern animal movement and where it came from. Because what exists now is really no different from what existed in the 1800s in Britain. It's basically the same thing, only it's not as progressive. Okay, before the 19th century, animals were things. They were entirely outside the moral community. Animals had no moral status whatsoever. Now, there were different reasons given for this. We couldn't have direct moral obligations to animals because they were regarded as outside the moral community. There were different reasons that were given. You had people like René Descartes, who believed that animals were not sentient, that they did not have any interests. Okay? So therefore, whatever we did to them didn't raise a moral issue. I can have a moral obligation that concerns this. Not to throw it at you, but that's not an obligation I owe to it. It's an obligation I owe to Laura. Okay? I can't have an obligation I owe to it because it has no interests. There is nothing I can do that can adversely affect this. Okay? And so Descartes, or at least on some readings of Descartes took the position that animals did not have interest because they weren't sentient, they weren't conscious. And so they were machines. They were machines made by God. Humans make machines, God makes machines, we make clocks, God makes dogs. But they're all machines. And so, they didn't have anesthesia back then, and Descartes used to do experiments on animals, and the animals screamed, and people said, hey, René, what are you doing? And he said, well, they're just like a machine that doesn't have oil. It's not really, the animal's not really screaming. The animal's just making a noise that an animal would, that a machine would make if the machine didn't have oil. Now, from what I can tell, Descartes, to the extent that he did believe this, Descartes is unique in the history of philosophy. Basically, nobody believed that. Okay? I'm not even sure Descartes did. Gary, you're a historian. Do you believe that Descartes believed that?
He claimed it philosophically.
Well, but he also says, is it the case that this is really the case, or am I just telling myself this because I want to continue to eat them? He says that, doesn't he?
He's pushed toward the conclusion because he wants to see all of nature in mechanistic terms.
Okay. Okay. But anyway, so Descartes is sort of unique in the history of philosophy. From what I can tell, basically, everybody else recognized that animals had interest, but that we could treat them as if they were things and exclude them from the moral community altogether because they were inferior. They were inferior. They were inferior either because they were spiritual inferiors. We are made in God's image. They are not. We have souls. They don't. Or they were cognitive or natural inferiors. We can reason, they can't. We can use abstract concepts, they can't. We use symbolic communication, they can't. So because of these, and there were some people like Aquinas, for example, who combined these things. I mean, Aquinas was a Catholic monk. He believed they didn't have souls, but he also believed that they weren't rational. So he was combining these two sorts of inferiority, spiritual inferiority and cognitive or natural, or whatever you want to call it, inferiority. Okay? And so that's really how we go into, at least in Western thinking, the 19th century, how we approach the 19th, we move into the 19th century with basically people believing that animals are outside the moral community altogether, either because they're not sentient or to the extent that they are, we can act as if they weren't sentient, don't have any interests. We can't have any moral obligations that we owe to them. We can only have moral obligations that concern them. Actually, there were law cases that if, I might have an obligation to you not to injure your cow, but that's not an obligation I owed the cow. It was an obligation I owe you as the owner of the cow. Okay? But basically, there was no sense that we could have moral obligations that we owed directly to animals, and certainly we couldn't have legal obligations that we owed directly to animals. Now, in the 19th century, this changes, and it changes pretty dramatically. And I'm not a historian of ideas, but I really think that it's dramatic in terms of how quickly it changes. As a result of progressive social reformers in Britain, who are concerned about race-based slavery, who are concerned about children, the treatment of children, who are concerned about the fact that women can't vote, etc. And Bentham, we always talk about Bentham, he was obviously important, but there were a bunch, Bentham, Mill, Premat, there were a lot of people who were involved with this, who said, we are being arbitrary. We're excluding animals from the moral community, and Bentham comes along and says, look, can they think, can they reason, whatever? Well, a horse is more, has more reason than a baby does. But what he says is, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that they can suffer. If they can suffer, then we can't disregard their suffering simply because of species. That we can't, to disregard their suffering because of their species would be similar to saying we can disregard the suffering of people because of race. Bentham was very anti-slavery. Okay? So he says, look, we can't disregard their suffering. The fact that they can suffer means that they have a moral value. We have an obligation we owe directly to them. Okay? Not a moral obligation that concerns them, but it's a moral obligation we owe directly to them. We can adversely affect them. They do have interests. What we do can harm them, and that harm matters. The fact that they can't sit around and do calculus, or that they can't compose symphonies, or whatever. The fact that, fine. But the fact that they can suffer means they're members of the moral community. We have moral obligations to them. Okay? Now, interestingly, does Bentham say, okay, we should abolish animal use? The answer is no, he doesn't. Why not? Because what's fascinating about Bentham was a utilitarian. Utilitarians basically don't believe in moral rights. What's right or wrong is dependent on consequences. They don't like rights because rights say can't balance anymore. Certain things you got to do or not do, and it doesn't matter about consequences. So if you have an interest, just so we're on the same page here, if you have an interest, whatever the interest is, there are only two ways to protect that interest: consequentially or non-consequentially. If you protect it non-consequentially, that's what we call a right. That we're going to protect that interest, even if the consequences militate against our doing so, or even if we think there are negative consequences. We don't look at the consequences, okay? I could take any one of you, you're all, healthy-looking people. If you were all vegans, you'd be even healthier. And I could take the organs out of you and transplant them into other people and save other people, save a lot of other people. But we don't say, well, should we balance should we look at who you could save? If we killed any one of you, who you could save? And he says, no. You have a right. Your interest in continuing to live is protected with a right, which is to say, your interest in continuing to live is going to be protected even if the consequences of not respecting that interest were wildly beneficial. Okay? All right, so Bentham is a utilitarian. He doesn't believe in moral rights. But interestingly, in the same footnote, for those of you who want to go into academics, keep in mind, everything Bentham ever said that we all talk about in terms of writing about animals was all said in a footnote. Think of what you can do. You can build a whole career in a footnote. And in a lot of ways, Singer's work hasn't really gotten beyond that footnote. So it just goes to show you what one lousy footnote can do. Okay, so in the same footnote, what Bentham says is, he talks about the moral right not to be a slave. Now,
the moral right, not he, Bentham, utilitarian, was talking about the moral right not to be slave. What the hell does that mean? I think it's absolutely clear what it means. Bentham believed in the principle of equal consideration, treating similar interests similarly. Everyone is to count for one. Everyone is treated, everyone's similar interest is given similar weight, equality, okay? I believe that Bentham didn't oppose slavery because he thought the consequences of slavery would be bad. He certainly talked about that, but he couldn't have believed that we could, he had to believe, he was a smart person. He had to know that there would be certain forms of slavery that we could design that would be that would actually be consequentially good, okay? But he still was an abolitionist. Why? Because he realized that if you have a slave and a slave owner, the slave's interests will always be discounted relative to the slave owner. There will never be equality, and slaves will never be beneficiaries of the principle of equal consideration. Their interests will always count for less than the interests of the slave owner. So therefore, what I believe why Bentham opposed slavery was he realized as an institution, chattel slavery excluded humans from the moral community. That they would be institutionally excluded from the moral community because their interests would always be devalued. Why did he not think the same thing about animals? Well, I mean, on one level, he probably wanted to continue to eat them. I mean, the desire to continue to eat animals has clouded some of the best minds in human history, really. It's quite remarkable. But I mean, now on a theoretical level, I think that Bentham's reason for not opposing the abolition of animal exploitation was Bentham believed that animals did not have an interest in continuing to live. Along the lines of what Michael was talking about, he thought they were sort of in this eternal present. Gary alluded to it before in his talk as well. That they were in this eternal present. That the cow doesn't care that you kill and eat her. She only cares about how you treat her and how you slaughter her. That's all she cares about. Okay? She doesn't care that she's food. She cares about how she's raised, how she's slaughtered. That she's living in this eternal present. She doesn't have a sense of her life. If you kill her, she doesn't know what she's lost. Okay? So what he says is we can continue using them, but we just have to treat them well. Okay? And we have to treat them humanely. Okay? We can't impose unnecessary suffering on them. As a result of what Bentham writes in that footnote, we get all of the animal welfare legislation in Britain in the 19th century. We have animal cruelty laws in every state in the United States. Most nations have an anti-cruelty law. I mean, so what's really remarkable is how quickly this turns. We go into the 19th century, animals are excluded from the moral community. We go into the 20th century, everybody's got an anti-cruelty law. Animals are regarded as members of the moral community. But it's okay for us to continue to use them because using them per se is not harming them. It's how we treat them. We have to treat them well, but using them per se is not a problem. Now, I reject that for two reasons. First of all, it is speciesism. It assumes that the only way, that the morally relevant form of self-awareness, or the form of self-awareness which is morally relevant for these purposes, is human-like self-awareness. You know, the fact that you can look in the mirror, you recognize yourself. You know, that you have, that you plan, you know, at 6 o'clock tonight, when this is over with, I'm going back to the city, I'm going to meet with some friends, we're going to have dinner in the village, whatever you're going to do. Okay? But it's this idea of you plan for the future, you have memories of the past. Okay? Is that self-awareness? Yes. That's the self-awareness that most of us have. You know, we have memories, we have future desires. We don't live in an eternal present. We have an autobiography. You know, we write this autobiography. You know, we're constantly engaged in creating this autobiography. Now, is that a form of self-awareness? Yes, it is. But I think that it is not the only form of self-awareness, and I think the whole problem with Bentham, and Singer really follows this. I mean, Singer basically says that with the exception of elephants and dolphins and non-human great apes, animals are by and large, you know, they don't have an interest in continuing to live. So therefore, killing them per se is not the problem. The problem is making them suffer. Okay, so that's basically, I mean, Singer is now starting to indicate some doubt as to that proposition. But nevertheless, what's really interesting about Bentham and Singer are both utilitarian. But Bentham is saying there's a right not to be a slave. And Singer doesn't talk in terms of rights, but he has this rebuttable presumption that normal humans should not be regarded as replaceable resources. That a normal human should not be regarded as a replaceable resource. That's either, for those of you who are into philosophy, either a rule utilitarian position or it's a rights position. It's basically saying the right to be a beneficiary of equal consideration means that you not be used as a resource if you're a normal human, because you have interests that can't be traded away. That becomes very deontological, very non-consequential, very non-utilitarian. But both Bentham and Singer's got his presumption against using normal humans as replaceable resources. Bentham's got his moral right against not being a slave. Okay? Because I think both of these guys realize that if you do that, what you're going to do is exclude humans from the moral community. Their interests will always be devalued. Okay? Now, is the self-awareness, one way of being self-aware is the way that you and I are self-aware. It's not the only way of being self-aware. I do maintain, that any being that is sentient is self-aware. I mean, I believe very strongly in what, there was a cognitive pathologist, he's now dead, or we would have invited him here today, but Donald Griffin, who's a very, very interesting guy, and he took the position, he said, look, if an animal is sentient, if an animal is perceptually aware, the animal is aware of its own self. So to say that it's not self-aware is arbitrary, because the animal isn't self-aware the way we're self-aware. It doesn't mean the animal's not self-aware, it just means the animal's differently self-aware. And if you think about it, what is sentience? Sentience is a means to the end of continued existence. So to say that X is sentient, but X has no interest in continuing to live, is like saying X has eyes, but X has no interest in continuing to see. I mean, it's a somewhat peculiar assertion to make. But let's assume, because Michael was talking this morning about do animals live in an eternal present? I don't believe they do live in an eternal present. I don't. We live with 5 rescued dogs, and we watch them all the time. We observe their behavior. There is no way in hell that those animals don't have a sense of self-awareness. I don't know what it's like, because they don't use words. I use words. Gary and I have these discussions many times. I think we both agree that they're thinking and they're using concept-y sorts of things, but we don't really know what they are, because we're human animals that our concepts are linked to language. So what is it like for them to think? And the answer is, who knows? But there's clearly something going on there. They clearly have the equivalence of many of the cognitive states that we have. But you know what? What if they didn't? Because you're never going to win this argument with somebody who says, oh no, they don't have cognitive. You're never going to win the argument. So I always say, look, fine. Let's assume they all live in an eternal present. Just like a human being who has got transient global amnesia. That is a recognized condition where people have no sense of the past, no sense of the future. They have a sense of themselves. There's a guy named Antonio Damasio who writes about these people. They have a sense of themselves right in the present. They don't have memories. They don't know what they did 5 minutes ago. They don't know what they're going to do in a half an hour. But they have a sense of the present right then and there. Now, is that different? That's clearly cognitive. That's a cognitive difference. There's nobody in this room, as far as I know, who's got transient global amnesia. So that form of self, they're aware of themselves in the minute, but they're just not. They don't have memories. They don't have the ability to make future plans. Now, is that different from us? Yes. Is the difference morally relevant? Depends what question you're asking. If the question is, who do we hire as a history professor at the university? Somebody who's got transient global amnesia or somebody who doesn't? The answer is you hire the person who doesn't have transient global amnesia, because the person who has it won't be able to teach history. But if the question is a different question, who do we use as a forced organ donor? Who do we use as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? The answer is you don't use either of them. I mean, the fact that the one being has a different sense of self-awareness, I mean, that being in that moment values himself or herself. So let's assume you got somebody with TGA and self-aware at every single second, without thinking about the past or without thinking about they value themselves. They are aware of themselves in the present. Is that different from us? Yes. Does it mean they're not self-aware? No. Does it mean it's okay for us to use them as forced organ donors? No. Or as, you know, and exploit them in other ways. Okay? So I would like to suggest that sentience is the only characteristic that matters. That, you know, you don't need to be self-aware beyond sentient. And if that's all you need. And I think that the whole Bentham thinking, you know, they don't care that we use them, they don't care about how we use them. Singer's views that, you know, that we're not harming them per se if we kill them. I just think it's wrong. I think it's speciesist. I think it assumes, it privileges a particular sort of self-awareness. I think the other problem with it is crazy to believe that we can use animals and have animals as property and ever give any morally significant consideration to their interest. Animals are property. They are things. They have no external or they have no internal or intrinsic inherent value. They have only extrinsic or external value. They have the value that we give them. Okay? We protect their interests. If you look at the history of animal welfare protection, you see that we protect their interests when we get a benefit, generally economic, from doing so. So, you know, you look at the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958 in this country, where it's required that large animals be rendered unconscious before they're shackled and hoisted unless it's ritual slaughter. Okay? Why did the industry go along with that? Easy. Because if you have a large animal hanging upside down that hasn't been stunned, they move around a lot, you have carcass damage, you have worker injuries, it is much cheaper to stun them. Okay? Much cheaper to stun them. The history of animal welfare legislation is basically reforms that actually make animal use more economically efficient. Okay? And that the level of animal welfare that the level of interest protection that we have historically given to animals is that which we need to give them in order to exploit them in an economically efficient way. Look at the campaigns that are being promoted right now by these animal welfare groups. Look at the fact that PETA and HSUS have campaigns to get Kentucky Fried Chicken, to buy chickens from processors that have gassed their chickens rather than have killed their chickens, because chickens aren't covered by the Humane Slaughter Act. Because in 1958, people thought, well, you know, chickens are small, you know, there's not going to be much carcass damage, there's not going to be worker injuries, it's not like a cow or a pig. I mean, it's not the same consideration. So because the economic considerations weren't there, chickens weren't covered by the federal Humane Slaughter Law. So now, animal groups are saying, you know, let's gas the chickens rather than kill them the way we're killing them. And if you look at the papers, I mean, when PETA and HSUS and these other groups are coming to you as animal people, they're saying, this is the right thing to do because it reduces suffering. But if you look at the papers that these organizations produce, they cite agricultural economic studies that show that gassing chickens reduces carcass damage dramatically and cuts down worker injuries. I mean, look, if you were starting a chicken processing plant tomorrow, you'd be out of your mind not to use gassing or controlled atmosphere killing. It is much more economically efficient to do that. Okay? So the campaign, what's happened in this country and in the world actually, is the large animal groups have become partners with institutional exploiters. And basically are advising them and working together to identify economically inefficient practices that industry, after screaming and yelling that everything's fine, they eventually agree to go along with. And then, you know, they have the kumbaya moment, and you know, and PETA says, oh, they care about animal welfare, and you know, I saw the other day, I saw on the Bell and Evans. Bell and Evans is a big chicken producer. And there was a quote from Ingrid Newkirk of PETA about how Bell and Evans was setting a new industry standard. You know, here is the head of PETA saying Bell and Evans is setting a new standard and showing that good animal welfare practice is also good business. I would agree with her there. Good animal welfare practice is good business. It's got nothing to do with morality. It has got nothing to do with animal rights. It has got nothing to do with recognizing that animals have inherent value or intrinsic value. It has everything to do with efficient exploitation. And so that, you know, and I think, you know, and this is what the animal movement has become. It's become a bunch of big, multi-zillion-dollar organizations that work with industry to make animal exploitation more efficient. There is not one of them, not one, that promotes veganism as a moral baseline. Yeah, they say veganism is a good way of reducing suffering, just like eating cage-free eggs. So when you tell the public, well, you know, you can be a vegan and discharge your obligations to animals and reduce suffering, but you can also continue to eat animal products and, you know, go to Whole Foods and buy, you know, animal welfare rating 3 of whatever, happy meat or happy eggs or happy whatever. And you can also discharge your moral obligations. You know what you get? You get people who don't go vegan, you know, because they think they can discharge their moral obligations by doing something less than going vegan. But not one of the large organizations, not one of them, promotes veganism as a moral baseline. They all promote it simply a way of reducing suffering, because I believe that they have bought into, look, this movement is Peter Singer's movement. There ain't no doubt about it. It ain't Tom Reagan's movement. It sure as hell is not my movement. It's Peter Singer's movement. They all basically have bought into this idea. I mean, why do you think, look, I'm critical of Peter, but I know Ingrid very well, and I'm quite sure that she takes seriously the fact that they're killing 95% of the animals they take in at their place in Virginia. Now, what do I think I haven't discussed it with her, but my guess is that she's bought into the idea that killing an animal painlessly is not harming the animal. They buy into this stuff. That if we take these animals in and we kill them painlessly, we're not harming them. They've all bought into this utilitarian way of thinking. And they're all hostile to the abolitionist position. They are all hostile to, Anna and I wrote a book, it's interesting, and I'm proud of it. Anna and I wrote a book called Eat Like You Care, which basically takes the position, if you care about animals, you don't have a choice. You know, you either continue to participate in exploitation or you go vegan. And the idea about vegetarianism, I'm not interested in that. I mean, vegetarianism is a morally incoherent position. There is no difference, no morally coherent distinction between flesh and other animal products. That, animals used for dairy are kept alive longer, they're treated every bit as badly, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. So, you know, I mean, this idea that, well, you know, I don't eat meat, so what? I mean, you know, you don't eat meat, you eat dairy, you eat eggs, it's all the same. It's really all the same. And so we write this book in which we say veganism is the moral baseline that you absolutely can't justify. If animals matter, then you are morally obligated to go vegan, nothing less. Whatever else you do, you're morally obligated to stop eating them, wearing them, using them. End of story. And we write this book, and there is not one large organization in this country that is selling it. And I am proud of it. Because it basically takes the position that anything less than that is a moral failure, and that animal welfare is a waste of time, and that distinguishing between flesh and other animal products is a waste of time. It's not morally defensible. And so we take the position, animals matter, you go vegan. And we said, no, we're not going there. Okay, fine, and I understand it. And for those of you who came to that conference called that conference misdescribed as Animal Rights 2013 in DC last year, where I appeared, then you know that those groups are not happy with the idea that veganism is a moral baseline, and that anything less than that is morally not defensible. And so I think, you know, and so that's what I'm trying to. Getting back to Zoopolis, when we ask the question, why is it that the animal rights position, i.e. the abolitionist position, is marginalized? And the answer is, that's easy. You've got every multi-million-dollar animal charity doing its best to suppress it, doing its best to mischaracterize it, to marginalize it, and to promote animal welfare reform and happy exploitation. I have a letter that I post on my Facebook site every opportunity I can, actually. Every single one. I look for opportunities to. It's a letter that was written by Peter Singer, signed by PETA, HSUS, Farm Sanctuary, Mercy for Animals, Compassion Over Killing, and all the large groups in which they, quote, express their, quote, appreciation and support for the happy exploitation program of Whole Foods. This was on the Whole Foods website for 2 years. And, you know, and it's, I mean, you've got all of these organizations, and they don't criticize Whole Foods, no, because Whole Foods is leading the way with their animal compassionate program, their happy exploitation program. That's why the animal rights position is marginalized, because the animal movement has marginalized it. And just as Bentham recognized that if humans are to be morally significant, they can't be slaves. Whatever other rights they have, They got to have that right not to be chattel property. Because if they don't have the right to be chattel property, they're going to be excluded from the moral community altogether. Because their interests will never be given equal consideration, because they'll always be discounted, because the conflicts that are relevant with slavery is between the slave and the slave owner. And their interests will always be devalued. And Bentham, I believe, recognized that. Did he say that? No. But I think that that's a very good, I believe that that good argument can be made that that's what Bentham saw. That's why he talked. A guy who never talked about moral rights talked about the moral right not to be a slave. Because he realized that if you're a slave, your interests will always be devalued. And just as Bentham realizes, even though he's a utilitarian, and just as we all recognize, whatever other rights people have, we disagree about rights, we disagree about what interests should be protected by rights, but we all agree chattel slavery is a bad idea. Because we all know that it's a sort of a different form of discrimination, because what it's you're not a person if you're a slave. You may be a person who's not getting the full benefits of personhood, and we can incrementally change that and improve it. But if you're a slave, you're not a person, you're a thing. You have no interest. You are not allowed to value your own interest at all. To be property is somebody else has the ability to value your interests and can value those interests at zero if that is what they wish to do. And so what I would suggest is if animals are going to matter, they have one right, a right not to be property. But if they had that one right, the world changes. We can no longer justify domestication. We have to stop bringing animals in, and Anna's going to talk a little about the domestication issue. But we are, well, I'm sorry. But that basically we can't justify the status of animals as property. That we have to, we should take care. We should stop bringing domesticated animals into existence. We should take care of the animals that we have here now, but we shouldn't bring any more into existence. But I really think that the challenge that faces us in animal ethics right now, today, April 11, 2014, it is not, with respect, I don't believe the problem with the animal rights position is it's not rich enough in terms of saying there are positive obligations that we have and there are other ways in which we can continue to benignly relate to animals. I don't believe that's why the animal rights position has been marginalized. It has been marginalized because the animal movement has marginalized it, because the animal movement is the animal welfare movement, and the animal movement today, April 11, 2014, is one big partnership with institutionalized exploitation. As long as that continues, there will never be any progress. So what we need to do, if you're concerned about this issue, is forget about these large groups. What we need to do is engage in creative, nonviolent, grassroots advocacy that focuses on one idea, veganism. As long as people are eating animals and wearing them, nothing changes. Once they stop eating and wearing them, everything changes. And it can be done. I always hear from people how hard vegan education is. And the answer is no, it's not. You need to learn how to do it, and you need to learn how to interact with people and how to educate, which requires that you have to educate yourself first. But you can do it. And I'll leave you with one final thought. In our book, Michael Vick, for us, is the gift who keeps on giving. We love Michael Vick. Because it's like everybody hates Michael Vick. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of that's racist. I'm sorry, I think a lot of that's racist. But I'm not saying what he did was okay. Of course it wasn't okay. It was horrible. But I mean, why do we hate this guy so much? I mean, it's like it's like a pathology with animal people. You mention Michael Vick, and people foam at the mouth. They get upset. They go crazy. They get really upset. Why? Because he inflicted suffering and death on animals, and he had no better reason than pleasure. And the answer is any non-vegan is similarly situated. So when you say Michael Vick was a really, I hear this all the time from people. Michael Vick, terrible guy, hate Michael Vick. And I would say, you feel the same way. Is your mother vegan? No. You feel the same way about your mother? No, why would I feel the same way about my mother? Because your mother's not vegan. Your mother's continuing to eat animal products. Your mother's, it doesn't matter the fact that Michael Vick did it himself, and we would go to the store and buy it. Who cares? It's like this is a law school that you're sitting in right now. One of the things that we teach people is it doesn't matter. I teach criminal law. It doesn't matter whether I kill you or whether I pay him to kill you. It's murder in both cases. So the fact that Michael Vick did it, and the fact that, you know, that people go to the store and buy meat, and buy cheese, and buy dairy, and buy eggs, you know, what difference does it make? It's all suffering and death, where the only justification is pleasure. That is palate pleasure. So what? Michael Vick likes sitting around watching dogs fight. We like sitting around the barbecue pit, roasting the corpses of animals that were treated every bit as badly, if not worse, than Michael Vick's dogs. You can get to people. I mean, really, you know, as much as I sort of feel bad. I've never met Michael Vick. I don't know who he is. I've never seen a football game in my entire life. I hate sports. But the bottom line is, I always feel bad for. It's like, you know, why does everybody hate Michael Vick so much? You know, if they thought about it, they would realize we are all Michael Vick. Anyway, talk about domestication.
Okay, I had actually planned to see some of my time, so Gary could change his presentation a little bit in light of this morning, so he's not just talking at us. But Bentham actually did come very close to the position that Gary was talking about in slavery. Because he really...
Can I use the microphone?
Okay. Bentham makes us aware that a lot of these ideas are much easier to formulate than to achieve. It's easier to think about than to do them, because he says, we shall easily perceive that the project of mitigating slavery by law is more easily formed than executed. And as someone who's been trying to use existing laws to protect animals for longer than I care to remember, I do sympathize with that. And I don't want to get away from the importance of the discussion of stopping animal use. I think we have to get to the point where the recognition of the negative right, which underpins most of our constitutions, most of the basic frameworks of legal systems, which will then, once you recognize that negative right not to be used for animals, knocks out all commercial exploitation, knocks out raising them for food, requires veganism. And then we can work out what version of social contract or citizenship might inform our decision about how we live with those animals that we still will come into contact with. Those liminal animals, perhaps we're talking about the ones that we have to think about when we're talking about development and housing and how we use the environment and being aware of the impact on animals. But if we slide anywhere into missing out that point where domestic animals essentially will not exist, or will exist by accident because we haven't been efficient in terms of ratcheting down the numbers, we will always find, as human beings, I think, a way to justify the use of animals that are here. If they are there, we will use them. And our history of using them is not good. Perhaps a different relationship would be possible, but it would require such a different human society that I can't plan anything based on that. So I don't want to move away from the push for vegan education, for the absolute bottom line statement that the use of animals we have no moral basis for continuing to use animals. Because then, we all know that the Supreme Court isn't going to wake up and say that animals are not property. We know that. It's not going to be like the rapture and animals are suddenly going to be, in one morning, they're all going to be full participants in any community. So I understand that, and there's a point of using examples for discussion. But if they're here, we will use them. And the animal rights groups that we have right now are frightened, I think, to say we can't use them. Because they rely on the present members of the organizations who like dogs and cats and can't imagine not living with them. So I noticed in Will and Sue's book that they thought the focus on the question of not bringing domestic animals into existence was a political error, because it had given an easy target as it says, it's provided an easy political target for those hostile to animal rights theory, including hunter and breeder organizations, which invoke those extinctionist quotes as a reductio to the very idea of animal rights. Well, we need to be confronting the fact that, yes, indeed, we are going to be happy to be really annoying the breeder and hunter organizations, and telling people why, and educating people on that. The other thing I'm concerned about is that there's also a criticism that abolitionist theory has so far thought to be requiring the prevention of breeding of animals. So yes, that is a manipulation of their wishes or their instincts or their desires or whatever, them functioning as animals. And I just want to, because the time is going on, I just wanted to focus on something that perhaps we'll pick up in the question and answer conversation later. Because it says, consider Francione's claim that, this is a quote, "It makes no sense to say that we have acted immorally in domesticating non-human animals, but we are now committed to allowing them to continue to breed." And soon we'll say this is an obvious fallacy, and uses the example of slaves freed in America, who had been brought obviously from Africa under extreme duress. And the justice certainly requires abolishing slavery, but that does not mean abolishing the existence of the former slaves and their offspring. Shipping slaves to America was certainly an injustice, but the remedy is not to seek the extinction of African Americans or to repatriate them to America. But I think the analogy certainly fails, because when you've got a juridical status like slavery, you can't turn it off with a switch. People did. People were slaves one day and there was manumission the next, both in ancient slavery and in race-based slavery here. So we haven't got a different species that doesn't fit in. We haven't got a manipulated species that can't function in the society to which they've been brought. Perhaps people would have liked to take it back to Africa, but there was no barrier except the property status of slavery to being fully operating members of the society here as it was at the time. It was a legal status. You can change that. I've got 56 billion animals in my mind right now that are going to be killed this year for food. If we change the property status for those 56 billion animals, we won't be raising them to slaughter weight as quickly as possible, which is in weeks for some species, months for some others, a very short number of years for the rest of them. We won't be killing them if they have a right not to be used as property and to go into the food chain. So now I've got 56 billion animals. I'm not talking about the fish, and I guess they'll sort themselves out. I don't know. 56 billion animals that, if you don't kill them, continue to grow. Now, I don't know much about animal science, but I have been enough to sanctuaries to see what a pig looks like if you don't slaughter him or her at the required rate at whatever number of months they're designed to go to slaughter. They keep growing. They look like Sherman tanks. They have arthritis because their legs cannot support that body. It was never designed to. And they have been manipulated and crossbred and purpose selected to get to a certain quality that we can put a financial value on as quickly as possible. If we stop that, what are we left with? We're left with species that are going to stumble through the rest of their lives with all the medical and social and psychological stresses that we put them under. And then I'm hearing that we should let them choose to breed again. I have a real problem with that, and I think perhaps we could pick that up in the answer session because we don't really have enough time to go into it now. But of all the manipulations that we've done to animals, the choice to not let them breed and this perpetuate is the one that keeps me up least at night. So perhaps we could pick up that later.
Sure,
okay?
we've got a few minutes.
Yeah, because I truly believe, and I think that goes back to what Bentham was saying with slaves, is if you've got a use for them that is permitted, they will not thrive. There is no ability for us to constrain our use in that way. I feel that extremely strongly. So while I'm cheered by the idea of reevaluating our relationships to the benefit of the domestic animals that we have now, that we do view as refugees from this system, that we do have an obligation to perpetuate that in the numbers that would necessarily be involved, does not augur well for their well-being in the future. I haven't heard someone explain to me why I should be valuing the perpetuation of domesticated species in that way. Okay? So we're going on to...
First, I want to clarify that I understand what you were saying. It sounded like you were saying that these large organizations, well, not only is utilitarianism itself bad, but these large organizations are not even, they're not even actually pursuing the most utilitarian outcome. Is that right?
Yeah,
Or they're failing to actually do what would be the most effective in alleviating suffering?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly. Yeah, yes.
And so I guess what I'm wondering though is, I'm very sympathetic to the view that you have that we should just not be. I guess what empirical evidence is there, or how do you persuade them that the most effective thing they could be doing is articulating the message that you want?
It's for their as far as their business model is concerned, what I'm articulating isn't effective. I'm not going to, I am not going to persuade my buddy Wayne Purcell. I've known Wayne Purcell for 25 years. I'm not going to persuade Wayne that he ought to pursue what I'm promoting, because most of the people who contribute to the Humane Society of the United States are dog and cat and horse people who are not interested in veganism. They're just a different group. They're people who like animals. And HSUS is not interested in getting those people to a different position by saying, listen, I have discussed this with various HSUS people. Why don't you take a different position? And it's sort of a waste of time, because I understand why they're not doing it. Look, even PETA, forget about HSUS, PETA. Dan Matthews, who is an executive with PETA, was interviewed a couple years ago, and he said that half of our members are vegetarian. Didn't say vegan, said vegetarian. The other half think it's a good idea. Well, if PETA, the supposedly radical, I don't think PETA is radical, I think it's very rational, but if the supposedly radical organization, basically its membership is half of them are vegetarian, and the other half are vegetarian. We don't know how many of those are vegan. You're not going to promote veganism as a moral baseline, because you're going to upset people who are donating to you. You want to keep these are businesses, man. You want to keep your donor base as big as possible, right? So you do that by making the people who eat at McDonald's say, hey, I can be an animal rights person because McDonald's buys from slaughterhouses that are Temple Grandin and approved. I'm an animal rights person. I'm not kidding you. I'm not, it's like funny on one level, it's pathetic on another, because that's what they've done. They've created a model where people who can eat at McDonald's can feel good about writing a check to PETA. So I'm never going to convince those people, because their business model is to have a huge donor base, not upset anybody, not get anybody, they'll say to you, if you're vegan, you're interested in vegan, they'll say, yeah, that's a good thing, you go vegan. And then you come along and you say, I'm not interested in going vegan, but I want to reduce suffering, so I'm going to eat cage-free eggs. Okay, you eat cage-free eggs. And that's what they're going to do. That's their business model. That's why these organizations are bringing in millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. Because what they're doing is, like the Catholic Church in the 15th century, they're selling indulgences. They're saying, okay, you want to continue to exploit animals, we'll do that. You write the check, and you can continue to exploit animals. Just go to Whole Foods and buy animal welfare, step 3. And you can continue to exploit animals. Eric.
Gary, I want to add on to that actually. This is something rooted in some of the work and the things you've said recently on your blog as well. One thing about the abolitionist approach is that, you know, in rejecting welfare reforms, like we're saying to companies, not just organizations, but actual for-profit companies, that the industries that use animals, that we're not trying to collaborate with them and get them to sort of modify how they're using animals, but to say we shouldn't be using them at all. And so we promote veganism and abolitionism, and those organizations, well, those companies will sort of change their practices as society changes, right? As more vegans exist, they'll start their businesses, right? They meet demand. And nonprofits will do the same thing. I think when we talk about partnerships going on, it's sort of implicit in the fact that they are partners, is that as the industries themselves shift to respond to a true vegan movement, the nonprofit groups will too. You might actually see, hopefully, new groups arise that have, you know, a stronger foundation in abolitionism.
But you're seeing it now, you know, sorts of things you do, and there's a bunch of other people with. I mean, you're seeing organizations that arise now that are arising in response, you know, that are saying, look, you know, we're interested in the, but you know, they're looking at a different model. They're looking, you know, you're not, you know, or the groups, these grassroots groups are not looking to become multi-million-dollar organizations. They're, you know, they're looking to do advocacy. And you know, look, the reality is, if we had a large vegan movement in this country, you'd get these welfare reforms anyway. I think the welfare reforms are useless by and large. But what you would get is you get what you got now, which is basically industry moving to become more economically efficient, you know, and claiming that the efficiencies result in better treatment of animals. You'd get that anyway, because if you had a vegan movement that was promoting no animal use, what would happen is these institutions would respond. They're not going to just sit there. They're going to try to convince people that it's all right to continue to consume animal products. So they're going to make these changes, the same changes they're making now. You know, they'll go to gassing chickens. They'll get rid of gestation crates. That's another insane. I mean, you know, the gestation crates are economically inefficient. When you have a sow confined in a farrowing crate and she can't move, and the piglets can suckle all the time, the mother's always moving around. She's crushing piglets all the time. The pork industry is moving away from farrowing crates because they're economically inefficient. And so, you know, I would imagine that what happens in these large organizations, I don't know, I don't have any inside information, but I would imagine that what happens in these large animal groups is they have people who sit and read the agricultural economics journals. And they identify economically vulnerable practices, and those are the campaigns they go after. Because you can find all sorts of literature out there about the economic inefficiencies of farrowing crates, I mean, look at the veal industry. I mean, that's a classic example. You take a cow, you take a little cow, you tether the cow in a by his or her neck, or actually by her neck, because by his neck rather, because the veal calves are all male generally. In a little tiny crate, they can't move, they get stressed, you have high veterinary costs. You take them out of the crate, you put them in a social unit, veterinary costs go down. So, I mean, like, you know, that's going to happen anyway. It's called economic efficiency. Remember, factory farming was something that started in the 1950s, right? So it's only now that we're identifying the economic inefficiencies of it. So that's going to happen. Industry is going to correct itself. Industry is going to, like, you know, as industry gets more information, the rationality of behavior in a capitalist, in any economic system, depends on full information. So as they get more information, you know, they'll adjust their practice. But none of this has got anything to do. If anybody really believes that these welfare reforms are leading in any positive direction, I can't tell you how much I disagree with that. I think it's doing one thing, reassuring everybody that continuing to consume animal products is an okay thing to do. Okay, we're out of time, and so thank you very much. What I would like to do now I have the pleasure, and it's a sort of a sad pleasure, of introducing Luis Chiesa. Kate, I pronounced it wrong, didn't I? Chiesa. All right, I'm sorry. Luis, you know, we looked at our conference and said, you know, abolition, regulation, citizenship, and I thought, we don't have anybody here who's promoting regulation. So I called Luis and I said, would you come and defend evil? And he said, yes, I will. But anyway, Luis, come on. He's at the university, he's a professor, he's a law professor at the University of Buffalo, and he's a criminal law guy and a very highly respected one. And I'm interested to hear how you're going to reposition the abolitionist regulation argument. Luis, do you want to use the walk around mic, or is that all right? You can use the walk around.
Well, that's fine. All right. Good afternoon. I guess I'm Luis Chiesa, as Gary pointed out. I am evil. I guess I'm a welfarist. I'm a utilitarian. I'm all things that are wrong with the animal, animal advocacy world. But again, before I begin, I want to thank Gary for inviting me here. And I am kind of not shocked because I knew that this was the case, but it's interesting to me how Gary's pointing out, which I think is true, right? That there really isn't a lot of constructive debate and conversation between abolitionists and those who advocate for animal welfare, and I think that's sad. I think that the fact that I'm here actually reflects that there is no such constructive debate, because clearly I'm not an animal ethics person. I dabbled in it. I wrote a couple of articles dealing with anti-cruelty statutes, what I do, criminal law, and the intersection of criminal law and animal ethics. But it's not really what I do, and I haven't done it in several years. So the fact that Gary called me, I think is symptomatic of something that's very wrong, because there are other people. No, not that he called me, but what I mean is that I am the person who is here defending this position when it's not what I do, right? But I guess Gary implored, right? We need someone to defend evil, and can you play that role? Sure, I can, and I will. Anyway, so, and since I'm not an animal ethics person, although I read some of the literature, you'll excuse me if I'm not as sophisticated as the previous scholars with regard to this. Anyway, so what are we going to talk about? Will Kymlicka and Sue Donaldson talked about what we would do the day after abolition. And what I'm going to do here with you is think about what we should do during the decades and centuries, or centuries before abolition. Right? And more specifically, what I'm going to say is that the answer is that we can't ignore that question. I think it's obvious, right? We can't ignore the question regarding what are we going to do with animals from now until then, assuming that abolition happens. And I also believe that we are morally required to reduce animal suffering as much as possible prior to abolition. I think these are two very intuitive claims. Number one, that we should care. I think everyone here agrees. And number two, that to the extent that we should care, what we should try to do is reduce animal suffering as much as possible prior to abolition. I'll try briefly and defend those claims. The rest of my talk will focus on that. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about the challenges that abolitionists face in answering that question, and the challenges that welfarists face in answering that question. And the argument will proceed in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about abolitionism and welfarism, and that's already been touched upon here. This is what happens when you are one of the last speakers. The previous speakers will have already said a lot of what you wanted to say. Still, I'll summarize, because I think I'm going to present this in a structured way that will allow me to make my points more clearly later. And then I'm going to explain, which I guess is the gist of anything of interest, if there's anything that I have to say, which is that I think that the debate now between abolitionists and welfarists should turn more on empirical studies regarding some questions that they think are, that both sides of the debate believe are central to their positions. I'll explain what those questions are later, rather than philosophical differences between the positions. All right, so let me begin with abolitionism. And I agree with Gary, by the way. You'll see that I won't use animal rights. I think Gary's totally right to claim, to say that welfarists are not supposed to believe in animal rights, and consequentialists are not supposed to believe in animal rights like me. I'm a consequentialist all the way down. And we're not supposed to believe in rights if we're going to be coherent, and they have appropriated the term, so I will use abolitionist as the right term. So according to Francione, I'm going to cite from Francione here. According to Gary, I think the central tenet of abolitionism is, and I quote here, the rejection of the notion that animal life has a lesser value than human life. Right? And if you express this in positive terms, then the chief claim of abolitionism is that animal and human life are ceteris paribus, all things being equal, of equal value. And then from this basic tenet, you can move on to claim that animals or humans are equal for the purposes of not being commodities, which is the gist of abolitionism, right? For the purposes of not being commodities, of not being used as property, of not being used as resources. And then given that abolitionists, that for abolitionists, humans and non-humans are equal for the purposes of not being commodities, abolitionists argue that in much the same way as it is universally regarded that it is immoral to treat humans as property, treating animals as property ought to be considered immoral as well. Now, as a result of this, abolitionists argue that the ultimate goal of animal advocates should be the abolition of the property status of animals. And Gary does very eloquently, as he has been doing for decades, just fleshed out that view for us. Now, one question which has also been discussed, I'm just trying to summarize, I guess, is why is it that abolitionists argue that animal and human rights, human life should be considered all things being equal of equal value? And then the answer is, as is usually the case with moral theories regarding animal rights, the answer is that animals, like humans, are sentient. And that's the starting point, as everyone here pointed out. Bentham was the first to express this insight in the history of ideas and philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. So what makes them, what gives abolitionism legs is the fact that animals, like humans, are sentient. They're capable of feeling pain. In the words of Gary again, all sentient beings, human or non-human, are equal for the purposes of not being treated as resources, just as an intellectually gifted human and a mentally disabled human are equal for the purposes of not being used as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject in a painful biomedical experiment. All right, now, this already foreshadows the next move in the abolitionist argument, which is that perhaps more importantly, not only is it that they're equal because they're both sentient, but also since sentience is the defining trait here that gives you access to personhood and to being considered a moral subject, then what follows from this is that abolitionists deny that there is any morally relevant difference between the abilities that different beings have for feeling different kinds of, or for having different kinds of experiences. Right? So, and Gary pointed this out regarding the fact that, yeah, I mean, it may be true, I think it is true, that humans have certain abilities and have certain experiences that dogs don't have and that chickens don't have. But I believe abolitionists claim that those differences are not morally relevant. They may be relevant for some judgments, right? I think Gary had this really cool example about the fact that dogs don't have taste in movies. Right? Your dogs don't have taste in movies. And therefore, but they actually do like to stare at the screen and sit with you, I think, something like that while you're watching movies. But Gary correctly points out, given that dogs don't have a taste in movies and don't experience any particular pleasure when they're seeing Frozen vis-a-vis Saw, I can choose without asking them which movie we want to play, right? Because they'll be equally happy. And that distinction and that discrimination in the context of picking the movie is perfectly acceptable for Gary, obviously, as it should, but that's not a morally significant feature that will dictate if we can treat them different for a bunch of different purposes, including implicit suffering, treating them as resources, etc. So then what this leads then is that abolitionists believe that the fact that some humans may have the ability to experience certain kinds of pain that animals can't experience. For example, the pain of agonizing for days over how future talk in an animal rights abolitionist conference will go when you're a welfarist, and this is not what you do. That's a pain that I think I can feel, and certainly animals can't. And you know, but it's probably, Gary argues probably correctly that it's not morally relevant that I can anticipate that and have that pain. That dogs don't, right? So anyway, in the words of Gary once again, and I apologize for citing so much Gary, but you know, he is sort of like the big theorist in this field. So Gary explains, the right's abolitionist position rejects the notion that any differences that may exist between human and animal minds mean that animals have no interest in continuing to exist, or that the sentient experiences of non-humans have a lesser weight than those of humans. The deficiency or difference may be relevant for some purposes, i.e. picking which movie you're going to show, for example, but it does not allow us to conclude that a human lacking the capacities that some philosophers, Singer, Reagan, Mill, pick your favorite philosopher, identify as giving value to life, does not have an interest in continuing to live, or that death is not a harm to her. All right, so basically I think I have just summarized the basic tenets of abolitionism, hopefully correctly. If not, you can wait until later to tell me that I mischaracterized it. So now welfarism. With regard to welfarism, I think that there are different kinds of welfarism, and I would like to see a little bit more discussion as to what welfarism actually entails, and whether all the different versions of welfarism, the one espoused by Bentham or Mill or Singer or other consequentialist philosophers, whether they can actually be bundled together into one. I think abolitionists usually assume that they can't. I'm somewhat skeptical. I'll sort of sketch why I think that there may be different kinds of welfarisms, and some that are more objectionable on the basis of typical abolitionist arguments than others, but this is just a very sketchy sketch. So anyway, what's the central tenet of welfarism that can be found throughout different welfarist philosophies regarding animal ethics? For Gary, again, sorry, but he claims that all welfarists, including those that he calls the new welfarists, share a basic commitment to the principle, to a certain principle, and that principle is that the commitment, and that commitment is essential to defining them as welfarists, and that principle is the belief that human lives are, all things being equal, of more value than animal lives. Right? And he believes, and we've seen it in Bentham and the footnote in Mill, etc. You see it running through welfarist philosophy, that animals count in the moral calculus because they suffer, but at the end of the day, and even in Reagan you see this, which is interesting, right, as Gary pointed out, but at the end of the day, Singer, Mill, Bentham, what brings them together, they're consequentialists, yes, but with regard to animal ethics is that at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, human life, all things being considered, all things being equal, is more valuable than animal life. Now, Francione is certainly right in this regard, that Jeremy Bentham and Stuart Mill believed that this was the case. As Gary puts it, Mill believed that it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Like Francione, I have serious doubts that it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And like him, I agree that Mill's suggestion that some pleasures are more valuable than others, at least in a morally relevant way, is, well, superficially plausible, ultimately unsound. I say it's superficially plausible that some pleasures are more objectively speaking valuable than others. For example, compare the pleasure that you get when you're reading Francione's Rain Without Thunder vis-a-vis the pleasure you get when you read Hustler magazine, right? I mean, in principle, one seems to be more superior than the other. And yeah, in a sense, one would hope that that's the case. But even if it's the case, I'm not sure that anything follows of moral relevance, right, from it, which I think is the ultimate point. Now, where I'm not sure that Francione is right is to equate the views of more modern welfarists with those of Bentham and Mill in this regard. I have Singer in mind. I believe that Singer is, and others, but I believe, and I have myself in mind, but I believe that Singer is inconsistent in the way that he fleshes out his philosophy, but I believe that you could tease out a consistent consequentialist approach to animal ethics from the basic tenets that Singer proposes. So I'm going to try and do that. The way I read Singer, he argues, as any good utilitarian should, that the basic interest of all beings, humans and animals, is to be free from suffering, right? And then furthermore, I believe that Singer argues that the interest that humans and animals have against suffering is ceteris paribus equal. So in terms of suffering, both are sentient, and therefore, for Singer as well, the point of departure is that humans and animals have the same interest in being kept free from suffering. Now, The rub is, that's true with regard to inflicting suffering, but as many here have pointed out, Michael and the two Garys, right? There's an issue regarding whether inflicting death, right, causes any kind of suffering on an animal for the reasons that have been discussed here, which because of the brevity of life, I will not go over with you once more. But I note, and this is something that Robert Gardner pointed out in his, I think this was a really cool book, 2010 book, The Animal Rights Debate, I think it's titled, with Gary. And Gary wrote the first chapter, 100 pages, and then Gardner follows with the welfare as defensing 100 pages. I think Gardner points something out that I think is true, right, in reply to the way that Gary Francione describes Singer, and it's that although Singer does discuss the question of death, the truth of the matter is that for consequentialist ethics, what really matters is suffering. And the question regarding death is sort of not the primary concern. It's there, and yes, Singer certainly says things about it, but I'm not sure that a consistent approach to the utilitarianism that he professes necessarily leads to obvious answers with regard to that question, regardless of how Singer actually answers the question. So I believe actually that his philosophy doesn't commit us, or those who follow consequentialist ethics, to think, to agree with this broad conclusion that animal life is said that his body was worth less than human life. Actually, I think properly understood, regardless of whether Singer would agree or disagree with me, I think he would, but I think that properly understood a consequentialist ethics that focuses on the sort of cognitive abilities that Singer focuses on. So as was pointed out here, Singer focuses on whether, and Michael I think dealt with this, whether a being has life plans, and then if that being has life plans, then when you kill that being, not only do you kill that being, but you also kill or frustrate life plans, expectations, hopes, desires, opportunities, etc. Right? There are different versions of this. Tom Reagan has a kind of version of this. But what's doing all the work, I believe it here, in Singer's account, is not species, the species that we're talking about, but rather whether that being possesses a certain kind of cognitive ability. So for example, I think if I were to give examples, the death of a normally functioning human is as harmful for Singer, I think, as the death of a normally functioning grade 8, for example. The death of a newborn human child is probably less harmful. This may seem abhorrent, right? But the death of a newborn child is probably less harmful than the death of a grown grade 8. The death of a person who is in a permanent comatose state is less harmful than the death of a dog, right? Because the dog may be sentient and the other being not. The death of a normally functioning adult is more harmful than the death of a newborn human, and so on and so forth. So I think that what's doing all the work in Singer's argument is not the species of the being that is being examined, but rather whether the being possesses certain cognitive capabilities, right? Some humans possess them, right? Not all, newborn children wouldn't, right? Some humans possess them, others don't, and some humans suffering from the condition, what's the condition area that you were talking about?
Transient global amnesia.
Right, transient global amnesia may not possess them, and therefore they should raise interesting issues for Singer's theory, in theory, right? And maybe he's not able to bite the bullet and say killing them is not a harm, which may be where his theory leads him. In any case, so some humans possess these capacities, others don't. But this approach, while perhaps abhorrent to some, an approach that may lead to saying, well, actually there's no independent harm in killing a person with TGA, is not, I believe, speciesist, because I think that the discrimination that this system leads to is not on the basis of species, but rather on the basis of some other traits. Another example here used by abolitionists is and they invoke the Tom Reagan example of the dog or the human, right? And Gary has a book, I believe, titled something along those lines. And I think that according to Singer, for example, if you have to decide, am I going to say, come up with whatever scenario you want, there's a house burning down, and you can say the dog or a child, who do you have to save, right? And I guess most people in the world would answer without a doubt, without thinking about it, you should save the child. I think Peter Singer is committed if he's consistent, or if you're a consequentialist that takes this point of departure as the right one. I think you're committed to saying, I'm not sure who to save. You have to tell me more. Right? It depends on what kind of animal and kind of human. And if the human is a newborn human and the other is a dog, perhaps you are actually morally required to say the dog, and it's a moral fault on your part to not realize that the dog may have more interest than the newborn child. I think that this is open to debating in each case if you're a consistent consequentialist. Now, this may be abhorrent, again, but I think it's not speciesist. Now, I think that the real criticism here, at least the one I think has real legs, is that the trait that Singer identifies and other scholars identify as the morally relevant basis for distinguishing between different beings, right, are not really morally relevant, for example. And that's what Michael was pointing out in a sense, right? So, I mean, who cares? And what Gary points out as well, I mean, who cares if you live in a state of eternal present, or if you can understand that you're a person whose existence will project into the future, right? And I think, you know, Michael and Gary have made good arguments for claiming, Singer, you're wrong. I mean, those traits that you have identified, self-consciousness, whatever you want to call them, those traits are real traits, and they may form the basis for discriminating in certain contexts, but they're not morally relevant, at least for the purposes that you are invoking them, which is saying that death is not a harm to certain beings, right? So this sounds plausible to me. I think reasonable minds can disagree with regard to whether this is right or wrong, but let's assume that Michael, Gary are right in this criticism. I don't think that reveals that Singer is a speciesist. I think it reveals that Singer was wrong in drawing the lines that he drew across the board, right, regarding humans and animals, across the board. He was wrong to do this, and he's devoted a lot of ink to talking about the relative value of different human lives, for example, which follows from exactly these principles. So this is not something limited to human-animal. It's something that would affect his whole approach to consequentialist ethics. And this is why, by the way, as Robert Gardner pointed out in that essay, in his debate with Gary, that Singer has actually, I think, received considerably more flack for his views regarding the value of human lives than he has for any views regarding, animal lives versus human lives, because this theory has implication for human lives just like it has for animal lives. Now, anyway, so for me then, what is it that binds all welfareists together? Well, number one, I think it's a commitment to consequentialist ethics. But it's a commitment to a particular type of consequentialist ethics that compels them to strive to reduce the suffering of sentient beings, humans and animals included, rather than to a commitment to the principle that human life is worth more than animal life. In other words, what many abolitionists have claimed is the distinctive feature of welfarism, which is that they, going back to the beginning, which is that they believe that all things being equal, a human life is worth more than an animal life. I think that may be true if you count heads of people who are welfarists, but I think that this is contingent. I don't think that this follows from their consequentialist philosophy. I think that a different kind of consequentialist philosophy would still qualify them as welfarists, but would not commit them to the principle that human life is all things being equal, worth more than human life. So, I mean, I believe that some, probably most, perhaps all, welfarists believe that animal life is worth less than human life. But I don't see any necessary connection between the consequentialist principle that commands reducing suffering, which is what these consequentialists believe, and that animals are to be taken into account in this calculus, between that consequentialist principle, which I do think is the key to understanding welfarism in a broad sense. I don't think that there's any necessary connection between that principle and the judgment that human life is more valuable than human life. Now, I think that there is a form of welfarism, or certainly there is a form of consequentialism that doesn't have to end up concluding that human life is more valuable than animal life. I agree that it hasn't been adequately fleshed out. It's not what I do, so I won't flesh it out. But, and because of the brevity of life, once again, I'll keep moving on. I think that the most promising avenue here is adopting some kind of rule utilitarianism, which Gary talked about. So a rule utilitarianism would be, I conclude that the best rule is to treat animals, the best rule to be observed is to treat animal and humans alike for all purposes. You can adopt this rule for consequentialist reasons, for utilitarian reasons, and I think that that can be done, that can be defended, and I think that still counts as welfarist as opposed to animal rights or abolitionists. I'll have to leave it there. Now, in addition to the philosophical difference between abolitionists and welfarists that I just fleshed out, abolitionists, there are also important differences with regard to the ultimate goals of these two camps. Right? The ultimate goal of abolitionists, as it should be clear by now, is to abolish the property status of animals. And in contrast, the ultimate goal of the welfarist is to eliminate the suffering of animals. Now, this may, the welfarist position, eliminate the suffering of animals, this may but need not coincide with the goal of abolishing the property status of animals. I mean, in principle, it may be possible to keep the property, in principle, there's no contradiction, right? In principle, it may be possible to keep the property status of animals and eliminate suffering of animals. Now, it may be very unlikely, which I think is the right answer. I think the right answer is it's very unlikely for the reasons that Gary pointed out. Once you have this disparate relationship, hierarchical relationship, it's pretty clear that the interest of the subordinate creature will not be taken into account as much as the interest of the superior creature, and that may lead to a world in which, even though in principle it could be possible to have property without suffering, in the real world it won't be possible to do this. And Gary has made this argument. I think he just made it. The problem with this argument, which I sympathize with, is that this is a consequentialist argument. And this is not that it's wrong per se to use them as resources. It's that it's wrong to use them as resources insofar as using them as resources will automatically generate suffering. And let me say again that I think a kind of rule utilitarianism could precisely say we should adopt a rule barring the use of animals as property, not because of any kind of rights theory, but just because we believe that if we allow the use of animals as property, it's very likely that animals will end up suffering for all of the systemic reasons regarding the institution of slavery or property that Gary was talking about. But I think you're still moving within the realm of consequentialist ethics. No, if I am right that this is a coherent position, and Gary actually pointed it out. He said that Bentham's approach, the one that regarding slavery, there being a moral right against slavery, Gary said this is either a rights-based approach or it's a rule utilitarian approach. And I think that there's breathing room here for arguing for many of the same outcomes that abolitionists want to argue from a welfarist perspective if you adopt the right kind of rule utilitarianism. Or this is objectionable for a bunch of reasons. The reasons that utilitarianism has historically been objected to. I won't get into them. All right, so before I move on let me summarize the essential differences here. The classical position of abolitionists is that abolitionists believe that animal and human lives are ceteris paribus of equal value. Welfarists, however, believe that human lives are of more value ceteris paribus than animal lives. I have claimed that that's probably true as a contingent matter, but that rightly developed consequentialist ethics, probably premised on rule utilitarianism, could end up for utilitarian reasons arguing that humans and animals are the same ceteris paribus and ought to be the same, and therefore this kind of rule utilitarianism could lead also to arguing for the same goal, which would be the abolition of property, not because of some sort of right-based reason or deontological theory of morality, but just for purely consequentialist reasons. And there's, anyway, okay, so let me move on. Now, what about the strategies? I just want to talk strategies and then I'll get to the end of my talk. Clearly, abolitionists and welfarists have different strategies for getting from A to B. A being where we are now and B being their goal, abolition of property or reducing or eliminating suffering. Given that the end goal of abolitionism is to abolish the property status of animals, abolitionists believe, as Gary very forcefully argued, that it is morally objectionable to eat animals regardless of how humanely they were raised. And as a result, abolitionists argue that veganism is the only lifestyle / diet that is not morally objectionable. And then this lays the groundwork, which I think is important. Gary pointed this out today. I think many people criticize Gary for not having, an abolitionist, for not having a strategy, for not being practical, for rejecting incrementalism. And the truth is that there is a strategy. Now, query whether the strategy works, but there is a practical strategy involved. And so it's not just an ideal theory. There's advocacy that can be done. And the strategy was already laid out by Gary, and he was actually practicing it and preaching it while he was here, standing here with you, right? And this is part of the practical strategy. This is not just a philosophical debate. So what's the practical strategy? You should know it by now. Given that eating animals necessarily assumes that the creatures are property, abolitionists believe that they should advocate for veganism, right? And this what we get to our goal of abolition incrementally, one vegan conversion at a time, and eventually we'll get there. And this is a practical approach. Now, the bind here, which is what Sherry pointed out in her talk, the bind here, right, is again, what do we do from now till abolition? And the problem is that one possibility is, well, we're not going to abolish the property status of animals tomorrow, or next year, or within the next 10 years, and who knows what, right? We're not. So what do we do from here to there? And then the bind is, how do abolitionists respond to measures that reduce animal suffering in the interim, right? Do we support them? Not we, right? I'm not an abolitionist. Do abolitionists support them? Are they agnostic? Do they just not say anything? Do they reject them? Do they just say this is pernicious, right? And the bind is that the bind is that if you campaign, if Gary and other abolitionists campaign for welfare reforms that reduce the suffering of animals without abolishing their status, they're sort of being complicit, right, in a system that treats animals as resources, which goes against their most basic principles. And this is the bind that Sherry was talking about. Now, here you have two outs here as an abolitionist, and it's unclear. I would like more clarity from abolitionists in general, not only Gary, from everyone. I think everyone has to think about this: is what do we do when we're in this bind, right? Do we say, no, don't vote for that, I reject any sort of welfare proposal short of abolition? I am going to go at this one vegan at a time, full stop. I will not concern myself with reducing animal suffering at all. Or will you compromise and you're going to say, I will support this, this is still horrible, but I object to this to the end, to the assumption that animals are property on philosophical grounds, but for pragmatic reasons I will support this measure, reducing suffering in the short term. Now, the problem here, the ambiguity I see here is that some abolitionists, like Francione, for example, have refused to support almost all animal welfare reforms, not only on the basis that it would compromise their ethical principles, which I would understand, right? I might say, well, we disagree with their ethical principles. But they have also consistently made the following argument. Not only are they morally objectionable because they continue to treat animals as property, but also the reforms are useless and a waste of resources because they really don't alleviate animal suffering in any significant way. Abolitionists consistently make this claim. Now, the problem with this claim is I have no idea whether this latter claim is true or false, because this latter claim is an empirical claim, right? The claim is that by giving in to welfare reforms, we are doing one of two things. Either we're actually not alleviating animal suffering at all because the changes are trivial and insignificant, or even if we are decreasing animal suffering now, this will delay eventual abolition. Or will, and Gary just made the argument, or it will make people feel comfortable, it would soothe their conscience so that they will not want to go for abolition and they will just be happy eating happy meat at Whole Foods. And this will eventually preclude abolition or make it considerably more difficult. That's the argument. I find that this argument on its face is plausible. I don't know if it's correct. It's plausible on its face. It's certainly worthy of discussion, but it's an empirical claim. This rises or falls on the basis of whether this empirical claim is true. This is not a philosophical claim. Right? And I think that that's very important, and that's going to be the basis for everything else I say here. So, for example, just a thought experiment for all of you abolitionists here. I assume I'm outnumbered like 198 to 2. So the thought experiment is as follows. Humor me with it. Assume that proposition X significantly reduces the suffering of chickens that nevertheless will still be killed for eventual human consumption. And just to be clear, assume that it significantly reduces suffering according to whatever standards count as significantly reducing suffering for you, for Gary, for whoever it might be. There's agreement that it does reduce suffering. It's not useless. It's not meaningless. It's not trivial. So let's just stipulate that. Now, would you, as an abolitionist, oppose such a reform because it reduces suffering of animals considerably today, but it will lead to increased suffering of animals in the future? That's one possible outcome, right? If you do, that's an empirical claim. I can't say that you're right or wrong, but we need to test this. Right? Now, would you oppose it because although it reduces animal suffering, it does nothing to change the property status of animals? That's a philosophical objection, right? Which you're entitled to hold, obviously. Would you oppose it for other reasons? If so, what are those reasons? Or would you support it while qualifying that the end goal should be abolition, but that we can't stand idly by while chickens are being tortured, knowing that we could do something to reduce their suffering significantly in the short term, right? These are all possible options. I don't know which one you would support, but note that some you could get away with arguing for some purely on philosophical grounds, whereas for others you have to be able to support your claim empirically at the end of the day. Now, here's where welfarism, in a sense, is in a better position with regard to the thought experiment, right? Because with regard to the strategies of welfarism, the strategies to advocate for anything that is believed to reduce the suffering of animals now, right? Even if the measures that they support continue to assume that animals are property and thus may be killed. So I am not in a bind. With my thought experiment, it's obvious for me what we should do, which is totally support proposition X. Now, there are a bunch of empirical claims here that might negate this. Gary has made, abolitionists have made some of them, which is, again, that the claim that these things are going to happen anyway because they are in the interest of those in charge of food production. Perhaps that's an empirical claim. I don't know if they would have happened anyway. Right? Gary has some arguments that that are plausible, but we don't know if that's true or not. And it would be cool to get some hard evidence with regard to this. All right. So, and this is the final part of my talk, which is the importance of empirical studies to appropriately framing the abolitionist welfarist debate. Now, basically, for example, let me to illustrate what I mean by the importance of these empirical studies. Hopefully, it's obvious to you by now. But again, I'll piggyback on my thought experiment. For example, it's unclear whether abolitionists ought to favor measures that would reduce the suffering of animals now, although it would maintain their status as animals. These measures are undoubtedly good for animals now, right? And it's objectionable whether an abolitionist should be able to punt and say, well, they reduce them now, but they won't in the long run. So for example, let's assume that Gary is right. And let me ask this question: is it better to significantly, under whatever definition of significantly we stipulate, is it better to significantly reduce the suffering of X animals today, knowing that doing so will increase their suffering, the suffering of animals, by twice X, right? So X, we reduce the suffering of X animals today, right? Or we reduce animal suffering by X today, knowing that in 100 years, whatever your time frame is, animals will now suffer twice X. Just to give a very radical example, in a world in which Gary is right? And maybe it's not 2x, maybe it's just 1.1x, maybe it's 5x, I don't know, right? But I posit that even to that question, it's unclear what the right answer is. Because the obligations that we have to people and animals today are different than the obligations that we have to people and animals in the future, people and animals that haven't been born. I mean, these are very difficult questions, and philosophers have puzzled over them for decades. Even in that case, the answer is not obvious. And you know, a further problem is that in the real life, we don't get to say, well, today it reduces suffering by X, but in 100 years it will increase it by 2X. In the real world, there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, as John Keynes pointed out, in the long run, we are all dead. There's an asteroid, and there's nothing to care about, right? In 10 years, we become extinct. Problem solved. We should have advocated for reduced suffering today. Right? In the long run, we may devise ways of creating real meat without having a real animal. And this is something that's being debated now by abolitionists and welfarists as well. We're in the process of getting this technology today. This may lead to eliminating the suffering of animals in the future. Now, I have no idea whether any of these things happen, right? Whether the entire human race will become extinct soon because of World War III or because of an asteroid, or whether we will come up with real meat without using a real animal by in vitro processes, and whether we can develop those in vitro processes without harming animals, which is another problem. Maybe we don't. I don't know. But the truth is that I don't know the answers to these questions, and the abolitionist doesn't know the answer to these questions either. Right? We're in the same place. So in order to answer whether we should significantly reduce the suffering of X today, knowing that it would lead to increased suffering in the long run, we should, I posit, at least try to figure out the likelihood that each one of these possible futures will happen. The likelihood that it will increase animal suffering by 2x or 3x or 1.1, that the world will end, that we will develop alternative ways of meat production that entail not harming animals, etc., etc. You know, perhaps introducing in vitro meat will still harm animals, in which case this isn't the solution. Perhaps we won't be able, you know, this doesn't solve the egg and dairy problems. Perhaps we'll be able to come up with artificial versions of those that taste the same way. Who knows, right? Technology is like that. I don't know. It's possible that we will figure these out. In any case, the question is, what should we do today if we're faced with this regulation that does significantly reduce animal suffering now? Right? Are we going to be chilled into not acting because of what might happen tomorrow? I think that's a difficult question. Now, regardless of these futuristic scenarios that granted will probably not happen, the big problem here is that it's unclear how we compare the relative value of those suffering today with those suffering in the future. Again, philosophers have tried to do this for a long time. And I don't know what the answer is. And at the end of the day, again, it's an empirical claim. It requires empirical support. And I think that any conclusion without empirical support is, well, plausible, like the abolitionist claim, is pure speculation. That's the truth, I think. I think all of the arguments that Gary makes regarding these consequentialist reasons for not supporting animal welfare, that it really doesn't reduce the suffering of animals, or that it may, but if it does, it will increase the suffering in the future, or will delay abolition, they all sound plausible to me, but they need to be backed up by empirical evidence. Now, there isn't a lot of empirical evidence out there, which is sad, right? Well, one is the 2010 Kansas State study, which regards the impact of welfarist advocacy on meat-eating patterns. These are the findings as reported by the Kansas State study. Number one, as a whole, media attention, I'm citing from the executive summary, media attention to animal welfare has significant negative effects on U.S. meat demand. Number two, direct effects of media attention are primarily associated with pork and poultry demand. Number three, increasing media attention to animal welfare issues triggers consumers to purchase less meat rather than reallocate expenditures across competing meats, which is a claim that abolitionists have made all the time. They say that these welfare strategies fail also because they may target a particular industry, but then meat consumption will change from that one to a different one. But this study seems to claim the opposite. And then the authors of the study raised the following implications from the study. U.S. livestock producers and industry leaders must recognize meat demand impacts exist in discussions and negotiations regarding legislatively triggered production practice requirements. And number two, influence of media on total meat expenditures suggests beef, pork, and poultry producers may be well served by collaborating in recognizing and responding to changing societal pressures regarding animal well-being. Now, I don't want to get into the soundness of these findings. In his blog, Gary has suggested that the study is methodologically flawed. He may be right. I have no idea. I confess to having absolutely no expertise with regard to a bunch of things, and empirical studies is one of them. So I will withhold judgment regarding whether this study is flawed until those who are well versed in the science underlying the study can issue their opinion. However, my point is that regardless of whether the study's conclusions are sound or not, this is most definitely a step in the right direction. I don't mean the finding, but the fact that there's a study. I mean, Gary and those who oppose Gary have been making claims for decades, and we just keep throwing out the same rehashed replies, right? That this is what's going to happen. If X, then Y, and then the others no. Y, it won't be Y, and it's going to be Z. And it's getting tiresome, right? Because these are empirical claims. These are not philosophical claims. And the fact that we have a serious study in the sense that you know it was done by professors, and maybe studies could get more serious, which is what you would hope. But the fact that we have a study is kind of cool, and it's cool because both welfarists and abolitionists are making strong empirical claims. I haven't talked about welfarists, but they make strong claims. They're saying these measures actually decrease significantly human suffering. I mean animal suffering. That's an empirical. I don't know if that's true, right? It may be true that Gary's right and it doesn't. And they're also making the claim, no, this will not delay abolition. Again, I don't know if it's true. I'm not picking just on abolitionists. Welfarists are making similar empirical things. And these studies, I think, go to the benefit of everyone. So basically, what the Kansas State study seems to me to be in tension with both of the two big claims of abolitionists, that welfare reforms do not reduce animal suffering now, and that even if they do, it will cause more animal suffering in the future. And they definitely seem to be in tension with the abolitionist prediction that successful welfare reforms, if we find them, will merely shift meat preferences that target a particular industry, will merely shift meat preferences to a different meat product. Again, let me be very clear. I know I said it, but I like to repeat myself. I'm not saying that these findings are correct, or that the abolitionists, and I'm sure Gary has a bunch of reasons that he will point out that show why I'm wrong in what I'm saying. I'm not saying that these findings cannot be contested. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not even saying who's right. But what I'm saying is, right? What I'm saying is that in the presence of an empirical study, I mean that in the presence of strong empirical claims, we should welcome the commissioning studies like this one. And that I think now, and I think that this is something that maybe the only contribution of my talk. I think what this study does now is it may have an effect on the burden of proof. There's something I call the burden of proof problem in the context of the abolitionist welfarist debate. And basically, let me summarize the problem as follows, right? Both abolitionists and welfarists are making strong empirical claims. I think that's right. Again, abolitionists don't need to make them. They could just say, philosophically speaking, ethically speaking, this compromises my principles at the end of it, using animals as resources. But to the extent that they do make strong empirical claims, which they do, the question is who has the burden of proving them? And then in Gary's debate with Robert Gardner sort of suggests this at one point, but then he drops it. But I think this is an essential question that should be given more thought. So basically, then the question is, must abolitionists who claim that welfare advocacy doesn't reduce animal suffering, and that if it does, it delays abolition and therefore increases future animal suffering, must they prove their claim empirically? They're making claims. Must they prove them empirically? Or may they legitimately require that welfarists first prove that their advocacy reduces animal suffering today? By the same token, must welfarists who claim that welfare advocacy reduces animal suffering today prove their claim empirically? Or may they legitimately require that abolitionists prove empirically that their welfarist reforms do not reduce animal suffering now? Right? So this is the burden of proof problem. I'm not sure what the answer to the burden of proof problem is. I do think that someone has to answer, because there has to be an answer. If we don't say who has the burden of proof here, if we don't discuss this, what's going to happen is what's happening now, which is that both sides speculate, but no one actually tries to prove their point with hard-ish evidence. So for what it's worth, right, I think that the relevance of studies like the Kansas State study is it sort of serves to shift the burden of proof, right? I think that now, there's a study out there. It seems to contradict some strong empirical claims being made by abolitionists. I think that abolitionists like Francione now have to take the study seriously, I think, and try and explain with empirical proof, not with, with more speculation, why the study is flawed. Let me give you a real-world example here where these claims are made. Take Proposition 2 in California, right? Now, I think that without additional information, a measure that requires cows raised for veal, egg-laying hens, and pregnant pigs be confined only in ways that allow them to lie down, stand up, fully extend their limbs, etc. I think that most people, when they hear it, when they read about it, and I guess that's why it's passed, most people believe intuitively that this reduces the suffering of animals, of animals. I think that's why most people voted for it, if I have to guess, right? So I think the intuitive claim is these welfarist reforms reduce animal sufferings, right? Of course, it could end up that Prop 2 doesn't reduce animal suffering at all. And Gary has pointed out, again, eloquently as usual, many of the reasons why this may not reduce animal suffering. However, and here's where I take issue with the state of the current debate, Francione's claims are mostly empirical, without empirical support. So reading, for example, from his blog, where, by the way, Francione tells people that they should vote against Prop 2, right? Or he says, hey, you can abstain as well. I'll give them that out, but he does say first, vote against it. He says Prop 2, this is Gary, will do nothing to reduce animal suffering in the short term. All right, I mean, perhaps, but I mean, something more needs to be said than just saying it, right? Proposition 2 will not even come into effect, if at all, until 2015. Well, yes, I mean, Gary wins in the sense that not today, right, in several years, but yeah, the point is when it entered, when it's actually effective in 2015. And then he goes on to say Proposition 2 has numerous exceptions and qualifications, and even if it does come into effect at some point in the distant future, and even if it's enforced, it will result in no meaningful reduction in animal suffering. Now, again, Gary may be right. But the claims in the excerpted paragraph here are just bare bones conclusions with no empirical support about a very important matter. How should I vote? Right? He posits, for example, that Prop 2 will not result in meaningful reduction in animal suffering, but he doesn't explain exactly why this is the case. Later, he explains that Prop 2 will only make people feel better about exploiting animals and will thus increase animal suffering in the future and delay abolition. This too is an empirical claim that requires empirical support that is lacking. So then the question, which is the burden of proof argument, is whether Francione has to back up his claims empirically, or whether he can place the burden on welfarists to back up the claim that that Prop 2 actually reduces animal suffering. Again, the burden of proof problem. I think we must take this question more seriously than we have, and I believe that both abolitionists and welfarists haven't taken it seriously. Now, Francione sometimes claims to have some empirical evidence. For example, he repeats this claim often. That animal welfare has existed, he said that at the beginning of his talk here. That animal welfare has existed for 200 years now, and that animals are being exploited now considerably more than they were 200 years ago. Right? He believes that this provides empirical support for his claim that animal welfare reforms do not reduce animal suffering. Now, I don't think this follows. It may be true, but I'm not sure it's true, right? And because of the brevity of life, I'm just going to point out a couple of reasons why I don't think this follows. Again, maybe Gary's right, but I think more work has to be done. First, I think these are obvious. It may very well be the case that without animal welfare today, I think Sherry pointed this out if I'm not mistaken, even more animals would be suffering today than the animals that are currently suffering. That's possible. This is as compatible with the last 200 years as Francione's claim. Right? So the claim is, sure, I mean, it has increased exponentially. But it may be the case that without animal advocacy, it would be even worse. Who knows, right? I don't know who's right. Maybe Francione is right. But this should require more serious, closer look. Second, at best, what Francione does here is he shows correlation between animal advocacy over the last 200 years and an increasing animal suffering. He doesn't show causation, obviously. And that's because he doesn't show that animal suffering has increased because animal advocacy has increased, or even that animal suffering has increased partially due to increased animal advocacy. There are other stories that could be told. It's entirely plausible that the increasing animal suffering over the last 200 years has been the product of factors that have little to do with animal advocacy. The most obvious cause is the emergence of new technologies that have made it easy and profitable to produce food in a way that mistreats animals. In other words, the increased animal suffering may simply be a product of the emergence of the modern factory farm. And you can also believe that the modern factory farm would have likely emerged with or without animal welfare for purely efficiency reasons. Now, again, I'm not saying that the story that Gary tells about the last 200 years is impossible. You know, I think it's possible. But what I am saying, though, is that Francione's story about the last 200 years doesn't amount, as he seems to claim, to empirical proof about the failure of animal welfare. In order to know whether the increasing animal welfare is due to the failure of animal advocacy, we again need harder evidence. We need empirical studies that we don't have. All right. Yeah, I'm basically out of time here. So what I just want to say is that, let me just conclude by saying again that you know, going back to Will and Sue, they said that they wanted to talk about what we should do the day after abolition. I want abolitionists to talk about what they should do during the decades or centuries before abolition. I know that they want to get to abolition by educating people so that they become vegans. I think we should all do this. I think it's maybe because I'm not into the debates and I'm not linked to any sort of big organization. I'm sort of surprised that we can't work together, recognizing that there are philosophical differences and that Gary's arguments are not taken more seriously. But you know, the question is not whether you are going to believe that using animals is ever morally unobjectionable, but the question is whether you think, as an abolitionist, that it is okay to support reforms that significantly reduce animal suffering, whether you think, as an abolitionist, that we can have such reforms, even if it's the case that the reforms that have been in place and that have been put in place in the last 50, 60 years are not that kind of reform. So, you know, if abolitionists argue that we should not do anything to reduce animal suffering during this period, I find that position to be morally objectionable. I don't know if you do, but I find it to be morally objectionable. I actually think that most abolitionists wouldn't make this claim. I think they do care about present animal suffering. However, they claim, which I repeated ad nauseum, that